The early morning air was thick with anticipation. It was 7:30 a.m. at the bustling JFK Airport in New York City, and the soft hum of passengers and the hurried shuffle of shoes against the polished floors echoed through the terminal. The lights flickered slightly as the bright rays of the sun filtered through the glass windows, casting long shadows along the sleek, modern walls. The air was warm, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee from nearby cafes, and the faint aroma of perfume from passengers rushing to their gates. Amongst the sea of travelers, one figure stood out, not because of his extravagant clothes or the shimmer of expensive jewelry, but because of the calmness in his demeanor. Ryan Carter, 17 years old, looked like any other teenager waiting for his flight. His clothes were simple: dark jeans, a navy hoodie, and a pair of worn sneakers. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, his eyes focused on the phone in his hand. There was nothing about him that screamed wealth or power, and yet he was the son of one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country. Preston Carter, the CEO of Carter Technologies, a name that commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. Today was Ryan's first solo flight, an experience that was both thrilling and terrifying. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sitting next to his father in the back of a private jet. This time, he was flying commercial in first class by himself. And while the flight itself was a small detail in his life, it felt monumental to him. It was his chance to experience the world on his own terms, to step away from the gilded cage that had always surrounded him. This was his moment of independence, his first taste of the world without the ever-watchful eyes of his father. Boarding pass? The voice of the gate attendant cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present moment. Ryan looked up and handed over his ticket, offering a polite smile as she scanned it and waved him through. The flight was to Paris, a routine business trip that had turned into an opportunity for Ryan to get away for a few days. He had been planning this trip for months, and though it was only a few hours away, it felt like the start of something bigger, something he had longed for. As he walked through the jet bridge and into the first-class cabin, Ryan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The space was elegant, sleek, modern seats arranged with a luxurious amount of room between them. The overhead bins gleamed with polished metal, and the soft, inviting lighting created an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. This was where the world's elite traveled, where they were treated like royalty, a world so different from the one he'd known, yet somehow it felt familiar. Ryan took a seat by the window, placing his bag in the compartment above and settling into the plush chair with a contented sigh. He was a little nervous. Okay, maybe more than a little. But this was a step toward something new. His eyes scanned the cabin, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where no one knew who he was. Not just the son of Preston Carter, but simply Ryan. No expectations, no whispers, just him. As the last few passengers filed in, Ryan's attention was drawn to a woman walking down the aisle toward him. She was in her mid-30s, wearing the crisp blue uniform of a flight attendant, her red lipstick perfectly applied. Her sharp cheekbones and carefully controlled expression gave off an air of authority. But Ryan wasn't sure if it was an intentional part of her uniform or something else entirely. Her eyes scanned the cabin, but when they landed on him, they narrowed just slightly. A flicker of something unspoken passed over her face, something like judgment. She stopped at Ryan's row, her gaze moving from him to the empty seat beside him, and then to Sarah, who was quietly settling into her seat. The flight attendant's eyes moved back to Ryan. "Is this your seat?" she asked, her tone sharp and dismissive, almost as though she already expected the answer to be no. Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness in her voice. Sarah, who had been quietly placing their belongings in the overhead compartment, looked over and smiled warmly, handing the attendant their tickets. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said softly, her voice calm but firm. "We're in 1A and 1B. The flight attendant barely glanced at the tickets before folding her arms across her chest. "This section is for first-class passengers only," she stated, her words cold as she looked at Ryan with what could only be described as a faint sneer. "You'll need to return to your correct seats if there's been a mistake." Ryan felt his stomach tighten. Was she really questioning him? He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her in disbelief. The tension in the cabin began to build. He could feel the eyes of the passengers around him subtly shift towards the interaction. Some glanced away quickly, pretending not to notice, but others looked on with growing curiosity. "This is first class, ma'am," Sarah repeated, her patience clearly wearing thin. She pulled out her phone to show the booking confirmation. "Everything was confirmed. These are our seats." The attendant's eyes flicked briefly to the phone, but she didn't seem to care. "I don't have time for this," she snapped. "You'll have to move to the back. Now." Ryan looked at Sarah, who seemed to be holding her breath, then back at the flight attendant. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being treated like this. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet somehow it felt like he was being punished for something he couldn't control. "This is my seat," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt heavy, like they carried more weight than he realized. The flight attendant didn't soften. Instead, she glared at him, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Are you talking back to me?" she snapped. Before anyone could respond, the slap came. A sharp, resounding crack echoed through the cabin as her hand made contact with Ryan's cheek. The impact was so sudden, so unexpected, that for a moment, no one moved. The noise seemed to hang in the air for a long second, and then everything went still. A few passengers gasped, their eyes wide with shock. Some lowered their coffee cups. A woman in the row across covered her mouth, her eyes fixed on Ryan. Ryan sat frozen. His cheek was burning, the sting from the slap still sharp, but his mind couldn't catch up with the reality of what had just happened. His hand instinctively reached up to his face, his fingers brushing the warmth of his skin. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He didn't do anything. He just stared at the flight attendant, still processing the reality of the situation. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, her expression unmoved, as though the action had been nothing more than a routine part of her job. "Don't raise your voice again," she warned in a low, tight tone. "Not on this plane." And then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, as though nothing had happened. Ryan's mind was reeling. What just happened? Why? His hand still rested against his cheek, but it wasn't the physical pain that had him frozen. It was the weight of everything else that had just transpired. The cabin remained silent, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Ryan reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he typed out a short message. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he hit send. "She hit me." The moment the message was sent, he leaned back in his seat, staring out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a slap. This was something else entirely, and he had a feeling that it wouldn't be forgotten. The cabin remained tense after the slap. The hum of the airplane engines felt distant, almost drowned out by the oppressive silence that filled the air. Ryan sat motionless, his hand still pressed against his cheek, trying to process what had just happened. Sarah, still in shock, looked at him with wide eyes, her lips trembling as she reached for her phone again, her fingers fumbling to unlock it. But Ryan's mind wasn't focused on the pain or the humiliation. He wasn't even sure if he could feel his face anymore. What bothered him most wasn't the slap itself. It was the way everything had happened so quickly, the way people had just watched. No one had stood up. No one had said anything. He had expected the world to stop, to speak out. But instead, it was like the slap didn't matter, and neither did he. "Are you okay?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she gently placed her hand over his. Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. How could he explain what was happening inside him? How could he explain the confusion, the anger, the shame, and the growing realization that this was the world he was living in? A world where someone could make assumptions about him based on the way he looked, and then humiliate him in front of everyone. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his father. "What do you mean she hit you? Where are you?" Ryan stared at the text, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he typed back quickly, his hands shaking slightly. "Still in seat 1A. He paused before adding, "She slapped me." Before he could put the phone down, another message arrived from his father. "Sit tight. Do not move. I'm on this flight." Ryan read the message again. His father was on the plane. He was here. Preston Carter, his father, the man who ran a billion-dollar tech empire, was on the flight with him. Ryan looked around the cabin, scanning for any sign of his father, but he couldn't see him. Where was he? As he looked toward the back of the cabin, a figure stood up from one of the rows in first class. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a presence that seemed to fill the entire space. His movements were deliberate, confident. It was his father. Preston's eyes locked onto Ryan's immediately, and the calm in his father's gaze was like a silent promise. Everything was going to change. The tension in the cabin thickened as Preston walked down the aisle toward the front. Every eye followed him, but no one dared to speak. Even Emily, the flight attendant, who had slapped Ryan moments earlier, froze in place when she saw him approach. Her confident smile from before disappeared, replaced by a look of panic. Preston didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded attention. "You slapped my son," he said calmly, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made Emily's face pale. Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. She blinked, clearly trying to process what was happening. But Preston didn't give her a chance to explain. "You didn't realize he was my son," Preston continued, his voice still even, but now laced with a cold finality. "Or you didn't realize what you were doing when you put your hand on him." Emily swallowed, her gaze flicking from Preston to the other passengers, who were now watching intently. She looked around, her confidence rapidly draining as the weight of the situation settled in. "I thought he wasn't supposed to be in that seat," Emily muttered, her voice shaking. "I thought he was trying to sneak in." "That's the problem," Preston said, taking a step closer. His voice was still controlled, but there was a dangerous edge to it now. "You thought, you didn't check his ticket. You didn't confirm anything. You just decided, based on what he looked like, that he didn't belong here." Emily flinched at his words, her face turning red with embarrassment. But Preston wasn't done. "You didn't think he belonged in first class, so you made a decision, and that decision will now cost you everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Preston turned his gaze to the flight crew area and motioned to one of the junior attendants. "Get the captain on the phone," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tell him Preston Carter needs to speak with him now." The junior attendant moved quickly, the urgency of the situation clear. Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling by her sides. The authority she had carried just moments ago had vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of her own actions. Preston didn't even glance at her again. He stood tall, his posture calm, while the rest of the passengers began to murmur amongst themselves. Some were shocked, others were in disbelief, but none of them moved. They were all watching, some with growing respect for the man who had stepped in to correct the injustice. Within minutes, the junior flight attendant returned, holding a phone to Preston's ear. "Captain, this is Preston Carter," he said, his voice steady. "I assume you've been notified." There was a brief pause as the captain spoke. "Good. I want her removed from all cabin duties immediately. She is not to speak to any passenger. And when we land, I want ground security waiting at the gate." The captain's voice crackled through the phone, loud enough that everyone could hear it. "Understood, sir. She will be relieved of duty at once." Preston handed the phone back to the attendant, his face unreadable. He looked at Emily one last time, his voice quiet but final. "Go to the back," he said. "Do not speak to another passenger. Do not move unless instructed. You are finished for this flight." Emily stood there, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. She slowly turned, her back stiff as she walked toward the rear of the cabin. The weight of the silence in the air was deafening. Every step she took seemed to echo in Ryan's ears. No one clapped, no one cheered, but everyone watched. Ryan sat still, his mind racing. His father had taken control. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about correcting the wrongs, about making sure this never happened again. And for the first time, Ryan felt something inside him shift. This wasn't just about a flight. It was about something much bigger. And Ryan, though still in shock, could sense it. The world had just changed for him, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The remainder of the flight seemed to drag on. The hum of the engines became a dull background noise, almost drowned out by the murmur of passengers in their seats. Ryan couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. The slap, the confrontation, his father's calm but decisive actions. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, but through it all, there was one thing that stood out above all: the silence. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening. No one spoke. No one laughed or chatted. The usual in-flight chatter was absent. Even the flight attendants, who had been so lively moments before, moved through the aisles with barely a whisper. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. The weight of what had happened seemed to linger in the air, pressing down on everyone. Ryan couldn't stop thinking about Emily, the way she had acted so confidently, so sure of herself, only to be reduced to silence when the truth came to light. Her arrogance had been shattered in an instant, and now she was nothing but a shadow of the person she had been. It was almost as if the slap had not only marked his cheek, but had also exposed the cracks in her facade. Ryan wasn't sure if he felt pity for her or satisfaction in seeing her come undone. But one thing was certain: she had underestimated him, and now she would have to live with the consequences. As the minutes ticked by, Ryan glanced out the window. The sky was a deep blue, the clouds painted in shades of pink and gold by the setting sun. For a moment, the beauty of the scene outside distracted him from everything else. It was easy to lose himself in the vast expanse of the sky, to forget about the awkward tension in the cabin and the chaos that had unfolded. But as much as he tried to focus on the view, something kept pulling him back to the reality inside the plane. His father, Preston, was sitting beside him now. His posture was calm, his eyes steady. There was no anger in his gaze, no rush to act. He had taken control when it mattered, and now he remained composed, his presence in the cabin a quiet declaration of authority. Preston didn't need to say much. He had already made his point. And yet, despite the calmness that surrounded him, Ryan couldn't help but feel a wave of admiration for his father. He had always known Preston as a powerful businessman, a leader in the corporate world. But today, Ryan saw him in a new light. It wasn't just about money or status. It was about doing the right thing, standing up for what was just, and taking responsibility when someone else made a mistake. "You're okay?" Preston's voice broke the silence, soft and steady, but with an underlying concern. Ryan looked at his father and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just processing." Preston's lips curled into a faint smile, the same smile he always gave when he was trying to reassure Ryan without making a big deal out of things. "It's a lot to process, son, but you handled it better than most adults would have." Ryan didn't know how to respond. Part of him felt like he had done nothing. He hadn't shouted, hadn't fought back. He had simply sat there, stunned by the injustice of it all. But his father was right. He had handled it. He had stayed calm in the face of humiliation, and that, in itself, was a kind of power. Ryan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. It was his phone. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the notification. It was a message from Sarah. "I'm so sorry for what happened. I'm so proud of you for handling it the way you did. You're stronger than you think." Ryan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. Sarah had been there for him, keeping calm when he couldn't. She had been his rock during the whole ordeal. Another buzz. This time, it was a message from his mother. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? I know today was difficult, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. Stay strong." Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. His mother had always been the one to reassure him, to tell him everything would be okay. But this message, coming after everything that had happened, felt different. It wasn't just reassurance. It was a reminder of the strength that ran in his family, a strength that had been passed down from his father to him. As Ryan typed out a quick reply, the plane began its descent, the familiar sensation of the plane's engines shifting as they moved toward the runway. The sudden change in altitude jolted him out of his thoughts, and for a moment, everything seemed to fade away. The discomfort, the unease, the sense of injustice. Ryan glanced over at his father again. Preston was looking out the window, his gaze distant but purposeful. He wasn't looking at the world below, not really. He was thinking about something else, about the next step, about the larger implications of what had happened. Ryan could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just a matter of handling one flight attendant. This was about something deeper. Preston turned to Ryan, his eyes locking with his son's. "This is about more than just today. he said quietly. It's about ensuring that no one ever feels like they don't belong, no matter who they are or what they look like. And that's something we're going to make sure changes. Ryan nodded, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. This wasn't just a personal experience. It was a moment of change, a moment that would ripple out and affect far more than just the flight attendants or the passengers on this plane. It was about changing the way people thought, about showing the world that power didn't lie in appearances or assumptions. It was in quiet strength, in standing firm, and in making sure that when something was wrong, it was set right. And with that, Ryan knew that today, despite everything that had happened, was the beginning of something bigger. Something that would make sure no one, especially not him, would ever be underestimated again. The plane continued its descent, the wheels touching the runway with a soft thud, and with that, the journey was far from over. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt of the landing gear barely noticeable. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered off, and passengers began to gather their belongings. But the atmosphere in the cabin was anything but typical. The tension that had built up during the flight still hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Ryan's mind was still reeling. The events of the day felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But now, as the plane slowed to a crawl on the tarmac, the weight of it all began to settle in. His hand still ached from where Emily had slapped him, but that was nothing compared to the emotional toll. He had been humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, accused of something he hadn't done, and slapped for defending himself. But now, as his father had promised, it was time for the consequences. Ryan felt a strange sense of calm as he followed his father down the aisle toward the exit. Preston walked with purpose, his strides long and confident, a stark contrast to the way Ryan felt inside. His heart was still pounding, his mind still racing, but somehow in his father's presence, he felt safe. The moment they stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, Ryan noticed the change. The usual buzz of airport activity seemed to quiet as they walked. Security guards stood at attention, passengers moved aside to make way for them, and a handful of airline employees gathered near the exit. They were all waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Ryan glanced at his father, whose face remained stoic, unreadable. Preston had handled everything on the plane with such calm precision, and now he was about to take charge of the situation outside the cabin. Ryan could feel the weight of his father's influence in every step. As they neared the gate, a group of airport security personnel stepped forward. One of them, a tall man with a sharp uniform, addressed Preston directly. "Mr. Carter, we've been instructed to escort you and your son to a private area for security. We've also been informed that you wish to speak with the captain." Preston nodded calmly. "Yes, I need to speak with the captain immediately, and I need you to ensure that no one leaves this terminal until this matter is fully addressed." The security officer gave a nod, signaling for the group to follow. Ryan felt his nerves flare again as they walked through the terminal, the eyes of passengers and employees following them. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a routine procedure. This was something bigger, something that would affect far more than just a single flight attendant. As they reached the private security room, Preston turned to Ryan. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll handle this. But remember, everything we're doing today is about more than just what happened on this flight. It's about making sure no one else ever goes through what you just did." Ryan nodded, though he didn't fully understand what his father meant. What more could happen now? Emily was already being dealt with, wasn't she? But he didn't question it. Not yet. A few moments later, Preston stepped into the back office with a small group of airline executives and security personnel. Ryan could hear the murmur of voices, but couldn't make out the words. He was left alone in the waiting area, the quiet hum of the airport filling the space around him. Ryan sat down, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to believe that everything was going to be okay, that his father's actions were enough to make things right. But the slap still stung, the humiliation still burned, and as much as he tried to rationalize it, the fact remained. He had been wronged, and now he was waiting for the people responsible to face the consequences. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Ryan's mind raced with thoughts of Emily, of her smug expression, of the way she had looked at him with such disdain. But he couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind now. Was she scared? Regretful? Did she even understand the gravity of what she had done? Before he could contemplate further, Preston returned. His face was still calm, but there was something in his eyes now, something that made Ryan feel like this wasn't over. "The captain has been notified," Preston said, his voice low but steady, "and so has the rest of the airline's senior team. Emily has been suspended indefinitely pending an internal review." Ryan's heart sank. He had expected something like this, but hearing it out loud felt surreal. He couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. Was suspension enough for what had happened? What about all the people who had witnessed the injustice and done nothing? Would they just get away with it? Preston seemed to read his thoughts. "This isn't just about her," he said, his voice softer now. "This is about changing the culture. The people who stood by and did nothing, they'll be held accountable too. We're not just punishing one person. We're making sure that no one ever feels like they can do this again." Ryan nodded, but his mind was still clouded. There was something deeply unsettling about the situation, something that made him feel like there was more to this than just Emily's actions. But as his father turned to leave, he felt a sense of reassurance. Preston's resolve was unshakable, and for the first time since the slap, Ryan felt like he was part of something bigger, something that could change the way people treated each other. As Preston and Ryan walked out of the private security room, the tension in the terminal hadn't quite lifted. The hum of activity resumed, but there was a noticeable shift. The air felt thicker now, charged with an unspoken understanding that something significant had happened. People moved with a quiet urgency, stealing glances at Ryan and Preston as they passed. Ryan kept his gaze straight ahead, but he could feel their eyes following him, curiosity etched in their expressions. The moment they exited the terminal, Preston stopped and turned to face Ryan. The distance between them seemed to shrink in that moment, and for the first time since the incident, Ryan saw the weight of the situation in his father's eyes. "Ryan," Preston began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything that had transpired. "What you've just gone through, it's not something anyone should ever have to experience, but you handled it with more grace and strength than most adults would." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He just stood there staring at his father. He felt numb, like he was floating in a strange reality where things didn't quite make sense. The words, the slap, the tension, it all felt too surreal. But as his father spoke, Ryan began to understand something. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Emily or the slap. This was bigger. It was about how people saw each other, how they judged each other based on nothing more than assumptions and appearances, and how easily someone could be dehumanized in the eyes of others. "I don't want to be a part of that world anymore," Ryan said quietly, his voice steady but with a hint of resolve. "I don't want to live in a world where people treat each other like that." Preston nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at his son. "You don't have to, and you won't. Not as long as I'm here." The words weren't a promise of protection. They were a declaration of change. Preston wasn't just going to sit back and let this pass. He wasn't going to let his son or anyone else be treated this way ever again. Ryan glanced up at the security detail standing nearby, and then at the cars parked outside the terminal. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Their world was about to change. No one could ignore what had just happened. The ripple effect had already begun. "Let's go home," Preston said, placing a hand on Ryan's shoulder as they began to walk toward the waiting black car. "We've got work to do." The car ride was silent for the most part. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine as the city passed by outside. Ryan leaned against the window, staring out at the skyline, his mind racing. Everything had changed in an instant. His life, his perspective, it had all shifted. His father's words echoed in his mind. This is about changing the culture. Preston wasn't just dealing with the aftermath of one flight attendant's mistake. He was tackling something much larger, something systemic. And in that moment, Ryan realized the true magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about shifting the way people thought, the way they acted. They arrived at the house a short while later. The gates opened as the car pulled up, and Ryan stepped out, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him once again. Preston looked at him before they entered the house. It's not over yet. We have a lot of work to do, and we're not going to stop until it's fixed. Ryan nodded, knowing that his father wasn't talking just about the incident. He was talking about changing the very structure of the world they lived in. And Ryan, for the first time, felt like he was ready to take on that fight too. The next few days were a blur. After the flight landed, things moved quickly. The media picked up on the story almost immediately, and Preston's name was plastered across headlines worldwide. It wasn't just because of the incident on the plane, it was because of how he had handled it. The calm authority with which he had stood up for his son, the way he had demanded accountability. The media painted him as a leader, a man who wasn't afraid to fight for what was right. But for Ryan, the attention felt suffocating. Everywhere he went, there were whispers, stares, people pointing. It was hard to escape the flood of emotions from the flight. Harder still to process everything. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and yet it seemed like it was all anyone could talk about. The slap, the injustice, his father's response. It felt like he was living in a story that didn't belong to him. The house was quiet when they returned, with no reporters crowding the gates or cameras flashing outside. But the tension from the flight still hung over Ryan like a storm cloud. Preston had insisted they take some time to process what had happened, but the weight of everything was hard to ignore. One evening, a few days after the flight, Ryan found himself sitting in the study with his father. Preston was at his desk, going through paperwork, things Ryan didn't understand or care to at the moment. The soft click of the pen in his father's hand was the only sound in the room. "I've made some decisions," Preston said, breaking the silence as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. Ryan looked up from the book he'd been absently flipping through. "What kind of decisions?" Preston met his eyes, his expression serious. "We're taking action. Emily won't be the only one held accountable. This is about more than one incident. It's about changing the entire culture of this company, of this industry. We're starting with our own." Ryan frowned. "You're talking about the airline?" Preston nodded. "Yes, there's an opportunity here to make a difference. This wasn't just about her mistaking you for someone else. It was about the assumptions she made about who you were, about who we are, and how quickly people are willing to dismiss someone when they don't fit the mold of what they expect." Ryan felt a ripple of understanding. He had been on the receiving end of that assumption. The instant judgment based solely on appearance, on who he was presumed to be. He understood the power of the moment, but he also understood the weight of his father's words now. Preston continued, "I've already reached out to the airline's executive team. We're going to overhaul the way we train our employees, starting with bias and empathy. Every flight attendant will undergo new training focused on treating all passengers with respect, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their presumed status." Ryan listened intently, feeling the shift in the conversation. "What does that mean for Emily?" "She'll face an internal investigation," Preston said. "But more importantly, we'll make sure this never happens again. I've already demanded that the company revise its policies, everything from how we hire, how we train, and how we interact with passengers. This is a problem that runs deeper than one individual." Ryan nodded slowly, beginning to process his father's plan. It wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about changing the system that allowed that behavior to flourish. "Will it work?" Ryan asked quietly. Preston smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a man who had all the answers. "It has to. The world is changing, Ryan, and we have to be a part of that change." Ryan sat back in his chair, taking it all in. The idea that something as small as an interaction on a plane could lead to something as significant as a cultural shift within an entire industry was a lot to digest. But he trusted his father. Preston wasn't just a CEO of a tech company. He was a man who knew how to build from the ground up. And now he was taking that same resolve to build a new foundation for how people treated each other in spaces where they should feel safe. Spaces like the one Ryan had just been humiliated in. For the first time in days, Ryan felt a spark of hope. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about making sure this kind of thing didn't happen to anyone else, ever again. Later that evening, Preston called a meeting with the airline's senior leadership team. Ryan was invited to sit in, something he never expected. It was a rare moment of inclusion, And while he wasn't sure what he could contribute, he knew he had to be there. This wasn't just about his father's company. It was about something bigger, something that involved everyone. As the meeting began, Ryan could see the determination in his father's eyes. The focus on his face made it clear that this was no longer just a family matter. It was an opportunity to change the world, starting with one company. Preston's voice filled the room, discussing the changes that would need to be made, starting with new policies, training, and a complete overhaul of the culture within the airline. Ryan watched in awe as his father led the room, setting a course for transformation. The meeting was long, filled with debates and suggestions from the leadership team. But through it all, Ryan understood one thing. His father wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let anyone be treated the way he had been treated, and neither would Ryan. As the meeting wrapped up and the team began to file out, Preston turned to Ryan, his expression calm but resolute. "This is just the beginning, Ryan," he said softly. "We're not going to stop until things change." And Ryan, for the first time since the flight, felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start, and that was enough for him. The days that followed were filled with meetings, phone calls, and planning. Preston's actions hadn't gone unnoticed, and the ripple effect was already starting to spread across the airline. The media coverage had reached a fever pitch, with reporters eager to hear Preston's thoughts on the incident and his plans for reform. But it wasn't just the public that was taking notice. It was the people within the company itself. Ryan watched as Preston worked tirelessly to make sure the airline's leadership team was on board with the changes. Every employee, from the flight attendants to the management, would be required to undergo comprehensive training on unconscious bias and respect for all passengers. The culture that had allowed someone like Emily to act with such arrogance would be dismantled from the inside out. As part of the new initiative, the airline started to implement a feedback system where passengers could rate their experiences and report any form of mistreatment or bias. It was a bold move, one that would ensure the airline became more transparent in its dealings with customers and made them accountable in ways they hadn't been before. Ryan sat in the boardroom during one of the meetings, watching his father as he navigated through each aspect of the plan with precision. Preston's ability to rally people to his cause was undeniable. Even employees who had initially been resistant to the changes were now on board, realizing that the shift wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. But as much as Ryan admired his father's leadership, he couldn't help but think about Emily, the woman who had slapped him, the woman whose actions had ignited this entire chain of events. He still didn't know what had happened to her after the flight. His father had made it clear that there would be consequences, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that her life had been irrevocably changed as well. One evening, a few days after the meeting, Ryan sat in the living room, his thoughts turning again to Emily. He hadn't seen her face since that day, but he imagined her sitting somewhere, just as confused and regretful as he felt humiliated. Part of him felt angry, but another part couldn't help but feel sorry for her. What had driven her to make such a rash decision? Was it pure prejudice, or was it something deeper? Ryan's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his father. "I need you to come to the office tomorrow. We're holding a press conference." Ryan raised an eyebrow. A press conference? He had no idea what it was about, but he had learned long ago that when Preston made a decision like this, it wasn't just for show. It was part of the plan to ensure that things didn't just change internally, they had to be seen changing externally as well. The next morning, Ryan found himself walking into the office with his father. The entire team was there, gathered in the large conference room, all eyes on the screen at the front of the room. Preston stood at the podium, ready to address the press. Ryan took his seat beside his father, his mind racing. The press conference wasn't just about defending the airline or explaining the changes. It was about showing the world that there was a new standard, a new way of doing things. As the first reporter stood up to ask a question, Preston's calm demeanor didn't falter. He spoke about the company's new initiative, about the mandatory bias training, about how every passenger would be treated with the utmost respect, no matter who they were. The media soaked it in, their questions becoming more pointed as the conference continued. Finally, a reporter asked the question Ryan had been waiting for. "Mr. Carter, what do you say to those who argue that this incident was isolated, That it was just one flight attendant who made a mistake? Preston's answer was measured, firm. This wasn't a mistake. This was a reflection of a systemic issue within the airline industry. We've tolerated this kind of behavior for too long. We've allowed people to make assumptions based on appearance, on class, on race, and we've done nothing to stop it. This is no longer about one employee. This is about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity. The words hung in the air, powerful and unequivocal. Ryan felt a surge of pride as he watched his father speak. It wasn't just the words, it was the conviction behind them. Preston wasn't just talking about the airline, he was talking about something bigger, something that could change the way people thought, the way they treated one another. As the press conference wrapped up and the reporters filed out, Ryan stayed in his seat, taking it all in. He had been unsure about the impact his father's actions would have, but now he understood. This wasn't just a small change, it was a movement, and Ryan was part of it. Later that day, after the conference had ended, Ryan sat down with his father in the office. Preston was reviewing some documents, but he looked up when Ryan spoke. "You did the right thing," Ryan said quietly, his voice full of admiration. Preston smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper. "It's not just about doing the right thing, Ryan. It's about making sure it sticks. We can't change everything overnight, but we can start the process. We're going to keep pushing, keep holding people accountable, and make sure that no one ever has to experience what you did." Ryan nodded, feeling a sense of peace. His father was right. This was just the beginning. But for the first time, Ryan believed that the world could be different, that the change was coming, and he was a part of it. The days ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer afraid. With his father by his side, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The company's internal restructuring was moving forward, with new policies in place and changes that would take time to implement. But while the business world buzzed with the news of Preston's bold moves, there was still one thing left to address: Emily. The incident on the plane had sparked more than just an internal reform. It had attracted public attention, leading to debates on discrimination, bias, and how quickly judgments were made. The airline had promised an investigation, but the truth was, no one really knew what was happening behind the scenes. Emily had been suspended, but there were questions, lingering questions, that people were eager to see answered. Ryan couldn't help but think about her. What had happened to her? How was she coping with the fallout? Emily had made a mistake, a big one. But did she understand the gravity of it? Did she even realize how deeply her actions had affected him? And how, by extension, how much they had exposed about the way people like him were treated in this world? One morning, nearly a month after the incident, Ryan's phone rang. It was a message from his father. "I need you to come to the office. There's a meeting today. It's time we have a more direct conversation with Emily." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this would be the final piece of the puzzle. He grabbed his jacket and left for the office, his mind racing. When he arrived, the conference room was already set up. Several members of the airline's senior leadership team were gathered, along with Emily, who was sitting at the far end of the table. She looked uncomfortable, her hands tightly clasped in front of her, her eyes downcast. She hadn't been expecting this. No one had. Ryan sat down beside his father. Preston's presence was commanding as usual. But this time, there was something different in the air. This wasn't about business. This was about confronting the truth, and the weight of it hung heavy in the room. "Thank you all for coming," Preston began, his voice calm but firm. "We're here today not just to discuss the events that occurred on Flight 227, but to address the larger issue that is at the heart of this company, and frankly, at the heart of our society." Emily's eyes flicked up to Preston's face, but she didn't say anything. She looked defeated, like someone who had been through too much to argue anymore. Ryan couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. She was about to face the consequences of her actions, and it wouldn't be easy. Preston continued, "I want to make something clear to everyone here. What happened that day was not an isolated incident. It's part of a much bigger problem, a problem of assumptions, bias, and a lack of respect for the humanity of others. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to continue." There was a long pause as Preston let the words sink in. Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between the executives in the room. Ryan could see the tension in her posture. She was no longer the confident, authoritative figure she had been on the flight. She was now just another person who had to face the consequences of her actions. "I've already made it clear," Preston said, "that we are taking full responsibility for the culture that allowed this to happen. But we also need to ensure that everyone involved takes accountability. Emily, I'm sure you've realized the severity of what occurred. I'm sure you understand that what you did was not just a mistake, it was an act of judgment based solely on appearance and preconceived notions." Emily finally spoke, her voice low but steady. I, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't realize who he was. I didn't think he belonged in first class, and I just acted." Preston nodded. "But that's the issue. You didn't think. You assumed. And your assumptions cost someone their dignity." Ryan could feel the heat rising in his chest. He didn't want to hear her excuses. He didn't want to hear her explanations. What she had done couldn't be undone. The slap, the humiliation, the way she had treated him like an outsider. There was no excuse for that. "I didn't mean for it to escalate the way it did," Emily continued, her voice shaking now. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't know." She trailed off, and Ryan could see the guilt in her eyes. It was real. She understood now. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," Preston said, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "And that is why we are here today, to make sure that this kind of behavior is never tolerated again." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Emily's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time since the incident, Ryan saw her as a human being, not just the person who had hurt him. She was someone who had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. Preston looked around the room. "This isn't just about one employee. This is about creating a space where everyone, regardless of their background, is treated with respect. It's about taking a hard look at ourselves and our assumptions, and understanding that the world we're building must be one where no one feels less than anyone else." Ryan's heart was heavy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something like peace settle inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about one flight or one incident. It was about making sure that the next generation wouldn't have to go through what he did. It was about making sure that the world knew that everyone belonged. As the meeting came to a close, Preston turned to Emily one last time. "You'll receive a formal review of your actions, and the consequences will be severe. But know this, you've been given a chance to learn. You've been given the opportunity to change. Don't waste it." Emily nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked as she left the room. The room was quiet for a moment before Preston spoke again, his voice soft but resolute. "This is just the beginning. We're not going to stop until things change. Not just for us, but for everyone." Ryan nodded. It was more than just a company change. It was a societal shift, and for the first time, he felt like he was witnessing something truly transformative. The days following the meeting were filled with action. Preston's commitment to change was no longer just a promise, it was a movement. The airline's senior leadership team worked relentlessly to implement new policies. Bias training sessions were scheduled, focusing not only on the actions of the staff, but also on changing the culture from within. It was a huge undertaking, but it was clear that the company was determined to make things right. Ryan continued to observe, both from a distance and up close. His father was more involved than ever, his focus unwavering. Preston had made it clear that this wasn't just about punishing Emily or making headlines. It was about transforming the entire industry, ensuring that everyone from the ground crew to the pilots understood the importance of respect and dignity for every passenger, regardless of their background. It wasn't just about words, it was about action. Ryan, however, found himself grappling with something deeper. He had thought that confronting Emily, having her face the consequences of her actions, would bring him peace. But the truth was, he wasn't entirely sure it had. Her apology felt genuine, but could it truly erase the impact of what had happened? Could the policies, the changes, the trainings, really ensure that this wouldn't happen again? He still remembered the way he had felt, the sting of the slap, the humiliation, the cold, dismissive gaze of someone who had decided he didn't belong. Even as the company moved forward with reforms, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that, deep down, there were others who still saw him the way Emily had. He wasn't sure if that would ever change. But it wasn't until a few weeks later that Ryan began to understand the full extent of the ripple effect his father's actions had set in motion. It was a sunny afternoon when Preston called him into the office. Ryan had been spending his days attending meetings with his father, learning about the changes being made to the airline. He was becoming more involved, but always with a sense of distance, unsure of his place in it all. He didn't yet know what kind of impact he could have. As he walked into his father's office, he could feel a sense of anticipation in the air. Preston looked up from his desk, a calm, serious expression on his face. "Ryan," Preston began, "I've just come from a meeting with the board. I want you to hear this firsthand. Your actions, the way you handled everything during that flight, have had a profound impact on the airline. But more importantly, it's had an impact on the industry. The way we do business, the way we treat people. It's changing because of you." Ryan sat down, trying to absorb his father's words. He hadn't expected this. It wasn't just about the airline anymore. It was about something bigger than himself. "The board has decided," Preston continued, "to make the changes you've witnessed permanent. But they also wanted to acknowledge something more, something that you've taught us all." Ryan blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Preston's eyes softened. "You showed us the power of silence. You didn't scream or lash out. You stood your ground with dignity, even when no one stood up for you. And that's something the world needs to see more of. That's why the board has decided to name a new initiative after you." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. "What?" "The new training program we're launching," Preston said, a faint smile appearing on his face, "will now be called the Ryan Carter Equality Initiative. It will be the foundation of our new company culture, and it will set the standard for how all employees across every division are trained in equality, respect, and bias awareness. The board felt it was the right tribute to the lesson you taught us." Ryan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He hadn't expected any of this. He had never imagined that his personal experience would turn into something so far-reaching. But here it was, his name, attached to a movement that was shaping the very foundation of an entire company. "Dad, I don't know what to say," Ryan whispered, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. "You don't have to say anything," Preston replied, his voice steady but warm. "You've already said everything, by how you've handled this, by being strong, calm, and showing that the true power lies in dignity and respect." Ryan sat in silence, trying to process everything. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had been overlooked, misjudged, or treated unfairly. And the impact wouldn't stop at the airline. It would spread like ripples on a pond, influencing the way people treated one another everywhere. For the first time, Ryan felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a passenger on this journey. He was part of something much larger than himself, something that could change the way the world saw people like him. That evening, as Ryan and Preston left the office, the weight of the day's events settled in. They walked side by side, their steps in sync. The world was changing, and they were at the forefront of it. As they reached the car, Ryan looked up at his father. "Do you think this will work?" he asked, his voice unsure. Preston paused for a moment, his gaze focused ahead. Then, with a calm confidence, he turned to Ryan and said, "It's already working, son. The world is watching, and we're showing them the way." Ryan smiled, feeling a quiet determination settle in his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Change had begun, and he was ready to be a part of it. The days that followed were transformative, not just for the airline, but for Ryan as well. As the Ryan Carter Equality Initiative was rolled out across the company, the ripple effects of that one flight, of the injustice he had faced, began to shape the future of countless lives. In the months following the press conference, Preston and his leadership team worked tirelessly to ensure the new training programs were implemented effectively. Every employee, from the frontline staff to the executive board members, went through intense sessions designed to eradicate bias, promote understanding, and foster an environment of mutual respect. It wasn't just about understanding diversity, it was about embracing it, about realizing that every person, regardless of their background, had the right to be treated with dignity. The Ryan Carter Equality Initiative became more than just a corporate program. It became a movement, one that went beyond the airline, influencing the broader industry and setting a new standard for corporate responsibility. But while the company changed, Ryan found himself changing too. No longer just the son of a powerful CEO, he had become an advocate, an ambassador for something bigger than himself. He had discovered that one person's voice, one moment of dignity, could spark an irreversible transformation. It wasn't always about being loud or demanding justice. It was about standing still, holding on to your values, and making sure that when the time came, you were heard. As the months turned into a year, Ryan's journey took on a new direction. He began to speak at conferences, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned. His voice was steady, his message clear. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't bitter. He was focused. He knew that the only way to change the world was to confront it head on, to acknowledge the uncomfortable truths, and to demand that everyone be seen for who they truly were, not for their appearance, their background, or the assumptions others made about them. One afternoon, nearly a year after the incident, Ryan stood on stage at a corporate diversity conference, his father sitting in the front row, watching him with quiet pride. Ryan had just been introduced as the keynote speaker, and as he stepped up to the podium, a wave of emotion surged through him. He looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, some familiar, some not, and felt a quiet strength welling up inside him. This wasn't just a corporate event. This was a chance to reach people, to make them understand that change wasn't about big gestures or grand speeches. It was about how we treated each other in the smallest of moments, the moments that defined who we were as a society. Ryan spoke for nearly an hour, sharing his experience, the lessons his father had taught him, and the vision for a world where everyone was treated equally. He didn't focus on the incident on the plane. He didn't dwell on the injustice he had faced. Instead, he spoke about what came after, about how he had learned to see the world differently, to challenge the biases that lived within himself, and how that shift had changed everything. As he concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause that made him feel validated. It was the knowledge that his words had made a difference, that people were listening, really listening. Backstage, his father was waiting. Preston stood as Ryan approached, his face unreadable for a moment before breaking into a smile. "You did it, son," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're changing the world." Ryan smiled back, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something that had shifted inside him. "We're changing it," he said quietly, "and I'm just getting started." As they left the conference together, Ryan felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the work he had done with the airline. It was about something much larger, the legacy he was building, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, judged, or mistreated. The world was a big place, but Ryan knew that his actions, his voice, could make it just a little bit better. In the years to come, as the Ryan Carter Equality Initiative expanded beyond the airline and into other industries, Ryan remained at the forefront of the movement. His father's company became a model for corporate responsibility, showing that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And as for Emily, Ryan heard through the grapevine that she had eventually left the airline, choosing a different career path. She had sent him a final message, a heartfelt letter of apology that he had read but never responded to. He didn't need to. The apology, in a way, had already been made. Her actions had been a catalyst for change, for learning, and that was enough. Ryan had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength wasn't about fighting for recognition or revenge. It was about creating something lasting, something meaningful, and that was exactly what he was doing. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Lessons learned from the story. The story of Ryan Carter and the significant changes he helped create is not just about resilience, but also about the power of respect and patience in the face of injustice. Here are some important lessons drawn from the story. The power of silence and patience. In a world often filled with impulsive reactions and tensions, sometimes silence and patience are the greatest strength. Ryan didn't scream or lash out in the moment. He remained calm in the face of humiliation. Rather than letting injustice erode his dignity and humanity, Ryan allowed time and truth to be the tools of correction. This not only helped him retain his sense of self-respect, but also opened a path for significant change. Practice respect in every situation. One of the biggest lessons Ryan learned is that respect is not a privilege. It is a fundamental principle. Every person, regardless of their status or background, deserves to be treated with respect in every situation. Judging someone based on appearance or preconceived notions without understanding their story leads to injustice. Ryan learned that to make the world a better place, we must treat everyone with respect, even when they don't meet societal standards of fitting in. The power of change from within. This story is not just about a single action, but about transforming an entire system. Through Preston's leadership, the airline began to address unconscious bias and respect. The company's internal changes were substantial, but what was most important was that the shift began at the core, with a deep understanding that equality and respect must permeate through every level of the organization. Lasting change happens when we look inward, challenge our assumptions, and choose to act with respect. No one is worth less. Whether it's Ryan or Emily, the story demonstrates that everyone has value, and no one should be dismissed or judged based on superficial traits. Every individual has a story of their own, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Those who mistreat others based on appearance or assumptions not only harm the person in question, but also diminish their own worth. The lesson here is that we must always see others for who they truly are, not based on what we think they should be. Powerful actions lead to deep change. Even though Ryan was not in a position of power in the airline industry, his actions sparked a massive transformation. People in power must understand that their actions can change not only one person's life, but also the course of an entire industry. One determined action can alter the way people treat each other, and it can create a ripple effect that reaches far beyond the immediate situation. Never give up on doing the right thing. The story of Ryan and his family is a testament to the importance of never giving up on what's right. Despite facing significant challenges, both Ryan and Preston persisted, making sure that their actions contributed to a bigger change. The lesson here is that while the road to justice can be long and difficult, if we stay committed to doing what's right, truth and fairness will eventually prevail. This story imparts a powerful message about fairness, patience, and the ability of individuals to create significant change in the world. We may not be able to change everything immediately, but each small action we take can have a wide-reaching impact and contribute to a more just society.